Hi, everyone. Happy International Women's Day, by the way. Did we mention that? I'm not sure if Samantha did. Anyway, hi. I am so excited about this panel. I get excited about everything, obviously, and gut health has really got me jazzed. So microbiome, as you all know, is a real buzzword these days, but many people don't know what that actually means. And honestly, I have learned so much just preparing for this panel. And what exactly is your microbiome? What role does it play in our overall health? As you're about to hear, it's a pretty big one. And could gut health be linked to an alarming uptick in colorectal and other digestive cancers among young people right now? Not only diagnoses, but also tragically deaths. As many of you may know, if you were alive in this far back, I lost my husband, Jay, to colon cancer in 1998. He was 42 years old. Our daughters were 6 and 2. And since then, having felt so powerless during the course of his 9-month illness, I have done everything I can to encourage people to get screened, even getting an on-air colonoscopy on the Today Show back in the year 2000, which resulted in a 20% increase in colonoscopies nationwide, which was so gratifying. Thanks. You know, in the years since, I've tried to keep this issue on the front burner. I took Jimmy Kimmel to get a colonoscopy a few years ago. I'm trying to get Kevin Hart to let me take him this year because he just turned 45 and he hasn't gotten back to me yet, but I will keep you posted. But over the last couple of decades, the percentage of colon cancer cases among young people under the age of 55 has doubled. I was particularly struck by this sentence in a recent Time magazine cover story. Research suggests that today's young adults are about twice as likely to be diagnosed with colon cancer and 4 times as likely to be diagnosed with rectal cancer as those born around 1950. And most young patients are diagnosed at stage 3 or 4, which makes these cancers even more difficult to treat. So what is behind this disturbing trend? What can we do about it? Dr. Nancy Yu is the director of the MD Anderson Young-Onset Colorectal Cancer Program. Dr. Susan Bullman is an associate professor in the Department of Gastrointestinal Medical Oncology. That's a mouthful, Susan. At the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. Julie Smolyansky is the CEO of Lifeway Foods. And I want to get right to it because there's so much important information that I hope you all will listen to really carefully and spread the word with all your friends and family members because it's so critically important. And we're going to turn this into a podcast on my podcast Next Question. So hopefully people can listen to our conversation who aren't here this morning. So hi, everybody. Well, let's give them a round of applause. Another group of kick-ass smart women. All right, Julie, we're going to start with you because I think your family history and business is so inextricably linked to gut health. You came to the U.S. from Ukraine in the middle of the Cold War in 1975. By the way, I'd like to apologize for our president, just parenthetically. Your parents had $116 to their name. Your mother smartly noticed that the food in America was very different from the food in the Soviet Union, and she decided to do something about that. Can you tell us what she did and how this set your family on a path to wellness, really?
That's right. Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. Thank you all for joining us at this very busy conference. So exactly, my parents and I immigrated from the former Soviet Union. When we settled, my mother really realized that while they grew up in scarcity in the Soviet Union, the foods were very different, and they were, typical food was a quart of kefir, and a loaf of bread. Very humble, but very nutritious, nutrient dense, with a lot of positive attributes. So she opened up the first Russian deli, Ukrainian deli in Chicago's Rogers Park, and then opened up 5 more throughout the country, throughout Chicago, and became an importer and distributor of Eastern European food. And she was like selling food to Brighton Beach or Los Angeles, places where Soviet immigrants were starting to settle through this mass exodus as the Cold War was winding down and perestroika started happening. So that launched them into the food industry. They went to Germany for a food buying show, trade show, and there my father bought 3 bottles of kefir in the grocery store. In Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in the Soviet Union, the Slavic region, kefir was something that was passed down generation to generation for over 2,000 years. Our ancestors consumed it in the Caucasus Mountains. It was passed down from babushka to babushka, grandmother to grandmother. And it was survived by the word of mouth, like what we're doing today, talking about the benefits. And my ancestors, intuitively in their gut, experienced a sense of well-being. And they lived past 100 years of age, and they attributed their longevity to the consumption of kefir. And it wasn't until 1908, which Dr. Elie Metchnikoff, he is, growing up in my household, he was like a rock star. He was like Eddie Vedder. My father talked about him endlessly. He talked about his research, and he was just the father of an immune system. And he won a Nobel Prize for this work. And he studied the impact of fermented milks, kefir, on the body. And he found that there was an important positive contribution to the overall health. And this was really the beginning of the gut kind of science that since then our doctors and doctors all around the world have been adding on to his original research and really bringing us to where we are today. But so that's kind of how it started. And so my dad bought 3 bottles. He tried a bottle and he said, wow, America has everything, but it doesn't have kefir. And my mother said, well, you're an engineer. Why don't you design a plant, start making it, and I'll sell it through my distribution system. And 6 months later, Lifeway Foods was launched in 1986. So Lifeway Kefir, you could find it all over the country now in every grocery store. And 2 years later, he took it public. You know, it was just the very beginning, but the growth has been exponential.
And I think still people don't know that much about kefir or kefir, however you say it.
Yeah.
How do you say it?
We say both.
Okay.
You know,
so
Chicago kefir or kefir.
You
kefir,
say
kefir.
kefir, I say kefir. Let's call
Yeah.
the whole thing off. Let's not call the whole thing off. But so how is kefir or kefir different? What is it exactly, and how is it different from other dairy and probiotic products? Because it has a little fizziness. Like, what is it?
Yes, so it's a fermented, that's a great question. It's fermented dairy, so it's a special combination of 12 unique cultures that we inoculate the milk in for over 18 hours, could be up to 24 hours, and it's inoculated at room temperature. And then it creates the reaction between the probiotics and the milk create a reaction to create this effervescent, fermented, almost like a bubbly, tangy taste and process. And over 50 billion live microbes exist in kefir. It's significantly richer than any other food product you can buy in those friendly bacteria. Typical yogurt only has about 4 cultures or less, and most of the yogurt in the United States is ultra processed and pasteurized after fermentation. We pasteurize the milk first, then we culture, and then we bottle. And so when you get it, sometimes you might even notice the bottle bloats. That's okay. That means the process is working. You just open it, let the air out, and drink it. It's fine.
Interesting.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I've learned so much about it. I'm going to go knock a few bottles down after this,
we all should.
after this panel. So Susan Bullman, our gut health expert, before we talk more about the value of fermented foods, let's first define the microbiome. So what exactly is it, and why is it so important for overall health?
Yes, so when we refer to our microbiome, we're talking about the community or collection of microorganisms that reside on and within our bodies. Most of these are bacteria, but also include fungi, viruses, archaea, and they begin colonizing our body from the moment we're born and remain with us throughout life, but their composition changes. And if you were to take your microbiome and you were to put it on a weighing scales, it weighs several pounds.
Really?
So similar to some of our internal organs, like a spleen or a kidney, right?
But so it's scattered all over your body, or is most of it located
Yes,
in your gut?
99% is within our gut, largely the colon. And it's here where these microbes, they set the stage for dynamic interactions in human health, including digestion, production of vitamins, priming our immune system, and also disease. They're involved in chronic diseases if you have a shift in what your microbiome looks like, so can contribute to cancer.
And sort of a screw up in your microbiome can create all kinds of internal problems, but also inflammation, right?
Exactly.
And inflammation is a whole nother panel, which we'll have to do another time. But
So that's called dysbiosis, what you're talking about, when the microbiome is out of whack.
out of whack,
Yeah.
and creates all kinds of medical issues. Well, I know that so let's talk about how, all these external things that are affecting our microbiome. And then, of course, Nancy, I'm going to talk to you about early onset colon cancer and other cancers. But, we all hear about ultra-processed food, right? It's a big buzzword. But I still think there's confusion of what are ultra-processed foods versus processed foods versus non-processed foods. So can you help us out, Susan?
Yes. So these ultra-processed foods, they're industrially manufactured products. They have little to no whole foods within them, and you can usually identify them by their lengthy list of ingredients. So they'll have things listed like chemical modifiers, additives. You'll see things like emulsifiers, stabilizers, artificial flavorers, sweeteners, and they have very little nutritional value. They don't look like they naturally should.
Yeah.
The thing is, you'll see them advertised or marketed as convenience. They're ready to eat. You can eat them on the go, and they're usually hyper palatable, so they're very tasty because they're packed full of sugars and salts.
Right, and that salt-fat combo that really can be addictive, right?
Addictive. So things that you would recognize as these ultra-processed foods would be things like sugary drinks. They'd be the snack foods, cookies, candies,
Crackers.
Some crackers as well.
Which is a bummer for me personally.
You have a look at the ingredients. There's some good options.
I do
right?
Wassa crackers. I think they're okay.
There's good options.
Okay.
Look at the list.
Okay.
Exactly. And then, certain meats that you would see, sausages, chicken nuggets, even having emulsifiers and preservatives within
They have
them.
a lot of nitrates, right, Susan?
Exactly. So this is the thing. There's the nitrates, nitrites, and sulfides. They're the preservatives. So you'll see them advertised as having a long shelf life, and they're pretty much bad for your gut health and permeability within the gut.
But what about processed foods? So you got ultra-processed, right? And so you don't want to eat those, and you kind of don't want to eat processed foods, right? If you can avoid them. But what's the difference? So just the fewer ingredients, but still a lot of them?
There's a NOVA score, right? So there's a specific way that they can be categorized as ultra-processed versus processed. So it's got to do with the amount of whole foods within the production for these food types.
What happens to our gut health or our microbiome when we consume a lot of ultra-processed foods, which I guess are kind of like junk foods, right? But
Exactly.
some that they say are healthy, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But what does it do to your healthy bacteria?
Yeah, so you have to think when you're eating food, you're not just eating food for your body, but you're also feeding your microbiome. So these microbes within our gut, they are relying on you to supply them with nutrients. And most of the beneficial microbes, they like certain types of carbohydrates so that they can produce short-chain fatty acids that help the gut. So by consuming many of these ultra-processed foods that are typically low in fiber and good sugars, you're not feeding your beneficial microbes, and you're pushing it towards an inflammatory subtype. But then that has a knock-on effect on something like a leaky gut or hyperpermeability in the gut, which is many groups have heard about lately.
Right, this gut permeability is really important because your gut is sort of surrounded by this mucus, right?
Yes.
I know, good morning, yum. It's like, but it's surrounded by this mucus which protects the bad stuff from
Exactly.
permeating into the rest of your body, right?
Exactly.
So this kind of delicate balance needs to be maintained, right?
100%. So if you think about your gut, your intestines, what you have is a single layer of tightly packed epithelial cells, and they're all the way along your intestines. And between these epithelial cells, you have a little gate, which is called tight junctions between our cells. And this controls what nutrients can pass into our circulation, which is very important when we're digesting food. And then above those epithelial cells, you have a layer of mucus. And this mucus is very important because it separates the bacteria and the undigested foodstuffs from actually interacting with those cells. We do not want bacteria to touch the epithelial cells. But what we know is when we consume these ultra-processed foods that have things like emulsifiers, so for example, polysorbate 80, that reduces that mucus layer.
Right.
And then also, you now have these microbes touching the epithelial cells. You have unprocessed or undigested food products touching the epithelial cells, leading to chronic inflammation. So that damages that little gate between the cells. It opens up, and now you've got food pieces, you've got pieces of bacteria going to your circulation, and that can lead to
And that is not good.
Not good.
Not good.
That's
okay.
the problem.
And Nancy, I know that you have been following this trend of more young people getting colon cancer, and I think we'll focus on colorectal cancer for the purposes of our discussion this morning because you oversee MD Anderson's Young-Onset Colorectal Cancer Program. So every year in the United States, everyone, about 80,000 adults between the ages of 20 and 39 are diagnosed with cancer. People under 50 is the only age group for which the risk of getting cancer is actually rising. So I know these cases, and I know from personal experience and also from people who have reached out to me as a result of what happened to my husband, how heartbreaking these cases are. Can you tell us a little bit, Nancy, about the population of patients you're seeing in your program?
Yes, so we're definitely, unfortunately, seeing more and more young people who are in the middle of building a career, forming relationships, raising children, who get diagnosed with colorectal cancer. What we see reflects the national trends, but I think young patients also seek us out. So they actually represent a third of all of our new colorectal cancer cases a year that we see. We see about 600 a year. Sadly, most of these patients are already stage 3 or 4 at diagnosis, so that means their tumor is already spread to the lymph nodes that surround the tumor, or unfortunately other parts of the body. Still totally treatable, but I think a lot of them come to us. What that translates to is that their treatment typically needs a lot of coordination, whether it's surgery plus minus chemo, plus minus potential radiation and other treatments. So our program really tries to coordinate that for the patient and make a whole program for them. We also know that these young patients are starting their cancer journey with already super packed lives, and so they have a lot of needs. We want to treat the whole person, whether it's fertility concerns, finances, employment paperwork, and other things, or whether it's just they want to see another young person who's gone through this or is going through this. So our program tries to coordinate these needs all together and try to treat the whole person.
But Nancy was telling me that, she was seeing 2 pregnant women who were in their second trimester who had both been diagnosed with metastatic colon cancer. And that means, stage 4, it's metastasized to your liver, to other organs. Stage 3, as Nancy said, it's gone through your lymph nodes, which are kind of the gateway from your colon to the rest of your body. And so tiny microscopic disease can be circulating throughout your body and later lead to metastasizing on other organs. So, and I think it's important to point out that 75 to 80% of colon cancer cases are what are called sporadic, where there is no family history. And in these young people, of course, there are things like Lynch syndrome and other familial polyposis. Don't I sound like a doctor? That do make you more likely to be,
Yes.
to have a colon cancer. But many of these people have no
Yes.
family history and don't have any of those underlying conditions, right, Nancy?
So up to 20% of the young patients can have a predisposition syndrome. And so what we say is, if you're young and you have a diagnosis, always get your genetics tested. So that if you fall into 20%, we know what to do. We can totally take care of you. The other 80%, though, don't have a known genetic predisposition. And so that's really the question, right? Why are these patients getting diagnosed?
And
so
that's
the fact
perfect.
that you don't have a family history doesn't mean that you're immune.
Right, right. And I think some people kind of convince themselves, oh, I don't need to get screened because it's not in my family. But it wasn't in my husband's family, so that's why it's really so critically important to get screened at age 45. And we'll talk about those guidelines in a moment. But first, I want to focus on why this is happening, because it's so upsetting. And I know there are a lot of theories, Nancy. Microplastics, right? Microplastics are kind of a new focus on a lot of science because we're ingesting so many tiny, tiny particles of plastic from things like plastic cutting boards, but they even think it might be getting into some of the crops that we're eating and all kinds of things. They're starting to find microplastics in fetuses. And so they're kind of everywhere, not to freak people out, but this is something that they're studying because it might be permeating that mucus barrier, Susan, that you were talking about. So microplastics is one theory, ultra-processed foods, which we talked about. The overprescription of antibiotics is something scientists are also looking at. Now, by the way, this is correlation, not causation. These are just theories. Epidemiological studies take like decades because you have to follow people their whole lives. But also red meat, alcohol consumption leading to obesity, which is also another risk factor. So, Nancy, having said that, can you just talk us through some of these theories and what scientists and doctors like yourself are looking at?
I get the hardest question, right?
I'm sorry.
So the why is definitely the question. We know that cancer is a complex disease, and so it's really hard to pinpoint one smoking gun, and often it's not one single thing. And so that's kind of where I think it is. It's going to be several things that probably work together. There are known risk factors for colorectal cancer, and there are things we already talked about. A diet that's low in fiber, high in red meat, high in processed foods, sedentary lifestyle, alcohol, smoking. Those are established risk factors for colorectal cancer, and the young patients are certainly not immune, right? So those are risk factors that we also face. But likely, there are also unknown risk factors that are yet to be discovered. And these are some of the things you mentioned, microplastics. And so I think some of the leading theories on that are all environmental factors, so chemicals. And if we think really about what Dr. Bullman was talking about, our gut is really the environment too, right? When the barrier is broken, the stuff that's outside becomes inside. And so a lot of it is about environment, but I think ultimately there's also genetic and environmental interactions that work together that probably make some people more prone to the same environmental insults. And then I think the last area that people are really paying attention to is there a vulnerable phase in our lifespan that make these exposures more impactful to us, right?
Is there a what? Sorry?
A vulnerable time period in our lifespan. Because when we look at our young generation, all of you here, you're very health conscious, right? You take care of your body. And so, and yet we're still getting diagnosed.
Yeah.
Well, every time we take an antibiotic, first of all, our medical model, the doctors are trained to cut and to prescribe drugs. They have not been trained to incorporate foods to heal. And food can either be the greatest medicine or the fastest poison. I always say, live dirty, eat clean.
Really?
We are, yes.
Okay.
I knew you'd like that one. Yeah, because we have become afraid of all sorts of bacteria. We are clean freaks.
The age for colon cancer screen, I don't know if anybody was here yesterday. I'm like the nagging fishwife with the rolling pin. The age has been reduced. It was reduced like in 2021. You now need to get screened for colon cancer at age 45 because of this reason. But I keep thinking about the young patients, Nancy, like you're seeing, who are in their 20s and 30s. So should the age be lowered even more? Should young people get some kind of test? And are the symptoms in your young patients different than the symptoms in older individuals? And can you talk about the symptoms that we all need to be aware of, especially, certainly everyone, but young people, because they're not being screened?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that young patients are disproportionately being impacted by rectal cancer than colon, and the rectal cancer is being closer to the outside, can be more symptomatic. So some of the symptoms are bloody stools, mucousy stools, pain when you pass a stool, abdominal bloating, cramping. But I think the thing to remember is that sometimes it's actually asymptomatic, and that's where screening comes in. So when we talk about screening, we're talking about subjecting a whole population of patients who are asymptomatic to a particular test. And that's why the age to start screening is such a hard thing to move, right? Because it impacts the whole society and the whole population. But while the policymakers are working on that, I think there's so many things we can work on. I always distinguish diagnosis from screening. So if you can have a symptom at any age. The key there is if you have a symptom, we're not talking about screening, we're talking about diagnosis. At whatever age that comes, don't delay, don't wait. I think as a culture, we need to be less shy about talking about our poop. I support the poop emoji. And then also...
And there's that children's book, Everybody Poops.
Everybody poops.
And, it's gross to think about it, but it's true.
Poop and bugs.
Yeah.
So I think that's number one. And number two, if there are symptoms, don't brush it off, right? We are all so busy. I think we're probably more likely to go to a coffee with a friend than call a physician to look in the blood that's in our stool. And so don't delay and really be our advocates. I think in addition, sometimes when people do get up enough courage to present to a physician, sometimes the first one you see poo-poos it and says, oh, don't worry about it.
Yeah, or they'll say it's just hemorrhoids if you see blood in the toilet. And
so be persistent. We are doing a lot among the professional societies to educate. The mass media is raising awareness. You're all helping. So I think the whole culture will change, but there are going to be people, unfortunately, who may dismiss you. And so be your self-advocate and really push for the diagnostic test. That's a different question than the screening test.
And I know that only 20% of people, because I just came from the Cologuard Classic and I did some interviews there, that only 20% of people age 45 to 49 are actually getting screened. So we need to really spread the word that the age has been lowered. And I think one of the interesting things, Susan, we were talking about before we came on stage was that Nancy's patients are incredibly healthy. These people in their 20s and 30s and 40s are like marathon runners. They are super health conscious. And I thought it was really interesting. Another thing that scientists are looking at, Susan, that you all don't mind that I'm calling you by your first name,
not
do
at
you?
all, of course.
That may contribute or that people are wondering about. Can you talk about that?
Yes.
And it has to do with protein.
Yes.
Like everywhere, I don't know about you all, but I'm so sick of seeing people on my Instagram feed talking about like eating grams of protein almost equal to my weight. And it's like, what? And I don't know. Am I the only one that's getting all these things, right? It's like protein craze central.
Exactly.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so if you go into the grocery store, you're seeing these protein drinks, you're seeing the protein powders, there's protein pasta, protein cereal, and protein bars, right? But they're ultra-processed foods. So these are the foods that have the emulsifiers, they have the stabilizers, all of those harmful chemicals that are disrupting our gut barrier, but they're being marketed to the health conscious individual. So someone who's not going to grab a Twinkie because they're like, this is not healthy, but a protein bar is a healthy alternative. So that's where the concern. So they are ultra processed. And the thing here, and I was telling you, Katie, before we came on, all of the studies and the dietary studies that look at a healthy microbiome, protein should only be like 15% of what you're consuming. So it's carbohydrate 60%, protein about 15%, and good fats, so these PUMAs, so the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, another 15%. So carbohydrates feed your gut microbiome, complex carbohydrates, fiber, things like, they're called fibers that these microbes will actually use as a nutrient source to produce these short-chain fatty acids that lead to that gut barrier. So this is a challenge with protein.
And you were saying, Julie, that, this sort of ultra-processed protein, because I was like, I should be putting protein powder in my smoothies because I want to have strong bones and muscles, right? But all this ultra-processed protein isn't even the right kind of protein, right?
Right. You want to look for high-quality, bioavailable protein, which is naturally occurring, like in a product like Lifeway Kefir.
Shameless plug.
Shameless plug. But it's real. It's true. Again, this is something passed down for generations, for 2,000 years. There's a reason why it survived for 2,000 years. I think also one of the things that has happened in the last 10 years is this plant-based movement, which has really done us a lot of harm. These are ultra-processed, lab-created, plant-based ingredients, and they have unfortunately really messed with our minds, and all these influencers and people who go on social media to talk about doing this and that with plant-based, anti-dairy, I'm anti-dairy, don't do dairy, evil dairy. That is so untrue, because really dairy, fermented dairy is not the same as just regular dairy. Fermented dairy creates this natural effervescent probiotic combination, and it's able to survive. So probiotics, not only do you want it to take, to have a probiotic, but you want it to be encapsulated in the dairy, because the gut is very acidic, and the probiotic has to survive the entire digestive tract. And out of UC Davis, Dr. Mara found that when it comes from a dairy source, that probiotic can actually go through the entire digestive system, through the rectum, and really do what it's supposed to do, what the science is saying that it will do. So that's critical, that not all probiotics are the same, and it really is important to get it from a dairy source.
So, Susan, if drinking milk is better than drinking almond milk?
Well, fermented milk.
Well, but what about regular milk versus like almond milk or soy milk? I drink regular milk because I just don't like almond milk in my coffee, but I do drink protein added milk. Is that what me?
Right? It depends on the source.
Fermented milk, and then
Okay, all right.
Drink kefir.
All right, but there are other good things that are fermented in addition to kefir. Kombucha,
Yes.
kimchi, yogurt. Those are very healthy. Talk about the fermentation process and why that's good for our microbiome.
Yes.
I'm going to start drinking kombucha. My daughter loves it. I think it's sort of funky, but I'm going to learn to like it.
Exactly. So these fermented foods, they actually contain live microorganisms, right? They're often referred to as probiotics, and they can be bacteria and they can be yeast. But these are generally beneficial microbes for your gut. So these are the good microbes that help maintain that gut barrier, help in the production of the mucus, and help in production of short-chain fatty acids that build those epithelial cells to be strong and prevent things from moving through. So the fermentation process itself is that these live microbes acting on, say, sugars and starch to produce organic acids that within the food, and that's often, you talked about that little acidic bubbly flavor, right? It's these little acids that are being produced by the microbes, but they aid in digestion. It aids in digestion, and it repopulates and balances your gut. So what you want to look for are these fermented foods that would have a range of different microorganisms. You don't want to just introduce one, you want to increase diversity. So there's been numerous studies demonstrating having a diverse gut microbiome is linked with beneficial health aspects for chronic diseases, even treatments for cancer, having a diverse gut microbiome.
I was going to ask Nancy, do you recommend that some of your patients eat fermented food, or has that not really been established?
Yeah, so I don't do it in practice, but we've been talking about maybe we should actually do a study to look at that.
Yeah, definitely.
I have had scientists tell me that try not to recommend taking a probiotic, for example, because that actually restricts the diversity of the microbiome.
Yes, if it has one organism. So there were studies done in melanoma patients that were receiving immunotherapy, and they looked at patients that were given a probiotic, so a single microbe, versus patients that were given fiber. And they gave patients up to 50 grams of fiber. So they saw that it was actually fiber that helped the patients respond better because it increased the gut microbiome diversity, whereas the single probiotic didn't.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've often wondered, and I talked to Jay's gastroenterologist, who I'm still close friends with, and I asked him, should I be taking a probiotic pill? And he was like, sure, it can't hurt. And I do think that there are a lot of people, supplements, that are taking advantage of like this new interest in microbiome and gut health and are selling probiotics. what do you think of those versus getting probiotics in your diet?
Food is always best. Go with the food. Because if it's something that you can, so for example, with kefir, you're not just getting these microbes, but you're also getting nutrition for your gut. You know, there's sugars within kefir that will help other microbes within your gut. And a key problem with these probiotics is engraftment, so them staying around, right? If you think about your gut as prime real estate, there's already microbes hanging out there. So you want to make sure you've got the right ones moving into your neighborhood.
Yeah.
So if you're drinking kefir regularly, you're ensuring that you've got the right population in your neighborhood hanging out and preventing the bad actors from setting up shop.
I think of them as little Pac-Men, you know, in your body, and they're eating all the healthy stuff that you're putting in there.
Exactly.
And you want to keep them there, right?
Yeah.
And not
We're feeding them.
And keeping the good ones.
Exactly.
By giving them good food.
Good foods.
Right?
It crowds out the bad ones. So kefir crowd the good bacteria in kefir, and we have 12 different strains, 50 billion CFUs per serving.
And there was a study, right? Another
Yes.
study that showed that it was really more on yogurt, right? That
Well, fermented foods,
fermented food.
but yogurt
But
was...
tell us about that study.
Yes, so a study out of Massachusetts found that they studied 130,000 patients over 30 years, and they found that people who consumed fermented dairy every day or every week, 2 times a week, had a reduction in colon cancer. And this is something that we're so excited about. It's just the beginning of understanding, but really kefir helps you grow a good gut garden. It keeps those bacteria replenished. Because every day our modern lifestyle, like we talked about, antibiotics, the processed foods, stress, social media, travel, all of that disrupts your gut biome and leads to dysbiosis. So you could be the healthiest person, you could eat very nutritiously, what you think is nutritiously, but if you're not replenishing the gut biome, you are creating a dysregulation in the gut biome. And then we know that it's contributing to all sorts of things, from mental health even. You know, there's a gut-mind connection.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, a gut-skin connection. You know, we are really learning the gut is the #1 brain. It leads to every part of your immune system.
Yeah.
90% of your immune system is controlled in the gut.
Yeah, and Susan, I wanted to ask you, so fermented food, that includes, is cottage cheese fermented? Because I love cottage cheese, and
Exactly.
and I eat a lot of
Yeah.
cottage cheese, and I mean enough with the cottage cheese recipes. Am I right? Is anyone like constantly scrolling food things on Instagram? Obviously, you know how I'm spending my spare time. But what about cottage cheese?
Yeah, that's a great source of cheese, right? Dairy, and it is included.
It is.
The organisms within it are not as diverse, for example, what you would see in kefir, but absolutely, it's a great choice.
Okay, I want to we're almost out of time. We have a little bit more time, and I do want to talk about this gut-brain connection, which is so fascinating, that what is happening in your microbiome actually affects your mental health. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating area of emerging research, and it's called the microbiome gut-brain axis. So if you think about your gut, you have your enteric nervous system, which we often call our second brain, and this is packed full of nerves, more nerves than in your spinal cord. And what we know is that there's microbes in the gut that help in the production of certain chemicals called neurotransmitters. So for example, serotonin, 90% of that is produced in your gut. That's our happy chemical. Then there's also GABA, which is gamma-aminobutyric acid, and that helps you deal with anxiety and stress. And dopamine, another chemical that is your motivation chemical. So we know that the gut microbes, beneficial gut microbes, are involved in the production of those important neurotransmitters that signal through this vagus nerve back to our brain. And these can control your mood, how you're feeling, but there's studies now linking it to depression, to a range of Alzheimer's even, right?
Really?
But they're emerging studies, and most of the functional work is in mouse models or rat models, and the correlative work are in humans. So we're still learning from that, so that gut-brain axis. But there was also outside of that, there was a recent study published in Nature Medicine that looked at, they characterized an older microbiome versus a younger microbiome in patients over the age of 50. And they saw this older microbiome, these patients had increased risk for cardiovascular disease. And when they repopulated the microbiome through a fecal microbiota transplant to this younger looking microbiome, it could reverse some of these effects. So it's a fountain of youth.
Yeah,
Yes.
I read about that weird, like, I'm sorry, the idea of a fecal transplant is
It's not
just
as
a
awful
little
as it
too much
sounds.
for me. But I think it's so interesting. So what you eat, you know, what do they say? You are what you eat. But what you eat is really, you know, can affect your mental health so significantly. Well, I think we should close by maybe just going down the line. I'm pretty sure I know what Julie's going to say, but what can we do to make sure that our gut health is in tip-top shape? I mean, and what advice, I guess specifically for colon cancer and early onset cancers for you, Nancy, would you have for everyone in this audience? And I hope, again, they're going to spread the word.
Sure. My take home would be look at your poop, and 45 is the new 50.
That was simple. Okay, good. All right.
Yeah, so my take home is the beauty of the microbiome is that it's modifiable. We can manipulate it. So we can take control by eating healthily, avoiding the ultra-processed foods, incorporating whole foods and fermented foods into our diet.
And fiber, by the way.
And fiber is huge. Fiber is huge. And then also exercise has a role to play in maintaining our microbiome. So we have control to some degree.
How does exercise affect your microbiome?
The links have been on increasing alpha diversity. So there's certain microbes that like aerobic exercise. So the links have all been correlative with increasing alpha diversity, which is what you want to train your immune system to identify cancer, because you know, when cancer arises, it actually is a failing of your immune system to recognize that. So if you can train your immune system to be strong and having those microbes interact in the gut, beneficial microbes with your immune system, this is the hypothesis as to how all of these factors come together. So it's not a single thing, it's multifactorial.
We're going to see a lot about prebiotics coming. You don't really need to take an extra prebiotic. It's in your food. Every time you eat berries, a banana, you know, kale, salads, that you're naturally getting those prebiotics.
So you don't need prebiotics, like as I said,
You don't
the
really.
industry, that, you know, supplement and health food industry, I think is going to take advantage of this, you know, great awakening about gut health. And probiotics, they're better to get them from natural sources instead of like in pill form, is basically what I heard. I'm going to stay away from protein bars and protein powder, honestly, because it's just not as good as getting real protein from real food. I'm going to be drinking my kefir. But I think this is so important because I just think, you know, I never understood the importance of gut health when it comes to almost every aspect of your physical health, and now we're learning of your mental health. So I had so much fun with this panel. Nancy, Susan, Julie, thank you all so much, and I hope you guys will practice what you heard. So.